What we ask the gods today is going to be very different than our ancient ancestors would have asked them in the past. They may have asked about the weather in the coming season, about fertility and the coming of new children, or maybe even the prophecies of war. But nowadays, the weather is told for us. We have medicine and modern science to help us survive ailments and childbirth and to ensure that we live long and happy lives. And even war is something very different now than it was even 100 years ago. Now, forms of divination have existed for thousands of years. In fact, it may be one of the oldest religious practices known to mankind. And oftentimes, what people wanted to divine was the answers to these questions of the weather, of fertility, of war. But now with the world changing, what is the point and purpose of divination? Is it still something that can be useful to you now, and how do you use it? So these are the topics we're going to be exploring today in this video on divination. So the two most known forms of divination probably to you are going to be the runes and then tarot cards. Now I do have to say, of course, that tarot is not a Norse pagan thing. This isn't a heathen thing. This is more of a new age practice. However, it is quite old. The earliest mentionings of tarot I could find were from around the 1400s. So it's been around for a very long time. However, it's not rooted in any form of Norse paganism from Scandinavia. It more or less came around the time of the Renaissance. So as far as the runes, I've talked about the runes pretty extensively on this channel. I have quite a few videos talking about them. But a quick recap on the runes. We have multiple hundreds of years ago, we have evidence of the Elder Futhark being carved into runestones and other stones, and then we have the writings of the Poetic Edda, most notably the Havamal, talking about runes as magic, and a few stories in between talking about runes being used in magic. And then really we don't have anything else until around the mostly the 1800s, that runeology and rune explorations came from. And so what the runes mean now is probably very different than the runes in the past, most notably divination. Divination is probably the thing that they may have been used for in the past, but we cannot prove that 100%, and definitely the techniques we use to divinate with the runes is something up for a great debate within the larger Norse pagan world. Now, divination in itself is definitely not something that is exclusive to Norse paganism, to Scandinavia of the past. It's something that cultures throughout the world have used, different forms of divination. There's bound to be hundreds, if not thousands, of different forms of divination out there, many of them we don't know of. But divination was something that was very important to the Germanic people, as written by Tacitus within his work in Germania. For divination and the casting of lots, they have the highest possible regard. They break off a branch of a fruit tree and slice it into strips. They mark these by certain signs and throw them, as random chance will have it, onto a white cloth. Then a state priest, if the consultation is public one, or the gatherer of the family, if it's private, prays to the gods and gazing to the heavens, picks up 3 separate strips, reads their meaning from the marks scored on them. If the lot forbid an enterprise, there can be no further consultation about it that day. If they allow it, further consultation by divination is required. So the few things we can get from this section within Germania. Divination was important to the Germanic people. They would take from fruit trees and draw marks on them. We don't know what these marks are, however. They could have been random lines, they could have been a set runology or symbolism, or they could be the actual runes themselves, but we don't know. We don't have any examples of this or any surviving examples of this, so we don't know what these marks would have been. They would have then cast the runes randomly onto a cloth, a white cloth specifically for them. I'm sure this varied though. And then the priest or the person looking over it, the head of the household, would then draw 3 lots from this and divine from them, whether good or bad omens. But we don't know, again, from this writing, what a good or bad omen from those signs would be. But this is something that we can go off of a little bit, because the most common rune pool is going to be a 3 rune pool, or the Norn pool, as I've heard it called before as well. And so it's really quite simple. You're going to take your runes, you're going to scatter them about, throw them out. There's a few different techniques to do this. And then without looking at them, well, at least this is how I do it, without looking at them, you pull 3 from that. And that right there is going to be your actual rune pool of divining something. So if you're asking a question of the runes, what are they going to be? What are these 3 runes telling you of the question that you're asking? And so there's a few different ways. I know some people, they'll just straight up scatter all the runes onto the cloth or whatever you're divining them onto, and then they're going to pick out from there, okay, these runes call to me. And that's going to be the divination for that. So there's definitely variations that take from this writing within Tacitus' work in Germania. And again, we have pieces of wood here that I almost just lost that have symbols on them, but again, we just don't know if they're the runes. Now, another form of divination that was used by the Germanic people was also mentioned by Tacitus, and also something I've talked about on this channel before a little bit, but we'll talk about it a little bit more here. The practice of consulting the cries and flights of birds is, of course, known also to us. Also the warnings of horses. And then it goes on a lot about horses and how horses were very magical and could divinate as well. And I've also read about magical cows, particularly in Denmark it seems like this is very popular, but I've also seen the tradition of a magical cow and milk being common within the writings of the Finns as well. And so magical animals that can divine things or produce prophecy, and even within the Gragas laws there's a line about not using animals to divine prophecy from. And so animals were an important part of divination in the past, and this is definitely something that's not common anymore, or at the very least not, you know, an owned farm animal, or at least not that I know of. Now, within wild animals and wild birds, this is something that can be quite common as well, and I think this is something a lot of people attach to, especially when getting into Norse paganism. For instance, a lot of people message me and ask about the channel, and ask if seeing ravens or crows is a sign that you need to start following Odin. Now, specifically, I usually say, you know, whatever calls to you. But in particular, when it comes to animals, if you're reading a sign from animals a positive thing, then it's a positive thing to you. If you just gave an offering, you just had a ritual or a powerful moment, and then you see an animal or hear a call, then more likely that's nature accepting it. And I think in our modern saturated minds, it's all too common that we just look past these things because we're so used to explosions and oversaturated life because of movies and television and just the lives we live. However, if you put yourself in the shoes of someone living thousands of years ago and you perform this big, powerful ritual, or you gave an offering to the gods, and then all of a sudden a bird swoops over you, you're more than likely going to take that as an acceptance of the offering or the ritual or whatever you were doing. For instance, last year when I went to Colorado with Logan and Mary and Caleb to go see Heilung, it was a magical experience because I've only been to Colorado, you know, the Rockies a couple of times, but we were sitting there looking at the beauty of the Rockies, and then all of a sudden above us flies down an actual raven calling from above as it flew into the valley. And we're just like, yeah, that's a sign. And then later on, we ended up seeing a moose as well, a couple of moose, after giving an offering to Odin as well. And so divining from nature is probably actually the one that's most known to you and you don't even know it yet. So, you know, having nature accept you or having nature accept what you're doing is a really great way to start practicing divination, is reading these signs of nature. Now, again, coming back to the more, you know, item-based divination. So we have the runes, of course. There's several different ways to do rune pools. I've seen people do massive rune pools, but I tend to stick with the 3. I think the 3 is something that I can actually attach myself with a little bit, and so I tend to do that one a little bit. And I would say that the results are pretty good. I find that, you know, if I'm struggling in a moment in life and I'm just like, oh, what's my answer? I'll pull the runes. And there's 2 ways to look at this. Now, this is where I'm a little on the fence with any form of divination, especially runes and even more so with tarot, is the placebo effect. Is just, you know, seeing what you want to see in a situation just because you want to see it. But I think there's also a benefit to that, because if you pull runes and you see these 3 and you're like, oh, strength, new day, and, you know, manhood, you know, it's like you're going to read out of those runes what you want to read out of those runes. And so whatever you take out of it is going to pertain to your situation. It's going to help you. And so the same with, and this to me is why I'm very hesitant with tarot, because I think that is mostly, in my opinion, and my experience with tarot, what tarot is reading into a placebo effect of a situation based on the individual. Now, having said that, I have runes all over my body. I have tattoos of runes, so therefore I must think they work in some way, and they must be magical. And maybe it's because with runes, we have that very long section within the Havamal talking about the magic of runes. And within Sigurdsfumal as well, we have an entire section on the magic of runes and how you should carve victory runes and beer runes and life runes. And so I think there is a magicness to runes. Now, I'm sure there's many people watching this video that's like, well, there's clearly a magicness within tarot. But maybe it's myself limiting my practice within Norse paganism of just not really getting into tarot because I don't really have any historical referencing point, because it's not really something I research. So I have nothing wrong with tarot or other forms of divination. As we'll cover here in just a minute, there are such simple ways to divinate that were used in the past. And so to me, that just proves that divination in itself does work, no matter what you're doing. So this set of tarot I have is actually a Norse Pagan one, a Norse mythology one. And so I received this as a gift from somebody. And so they're very beautiful. I think they're very beautiful cards. And so I just like having them for that, but I've never actually done a pool or anything like that. And the book that comes with it has actually got some really great information as well. And so you got cards like Ymir, you know, Ask and Imbla, Aegir, Aegir, Mimir. There's just so many great characters in here. And of course the book goes into what these individual, you know, beings and things mean when you're actually divinating. And so I just kind of like this set. I think it's really cool. And I think tarot can just be a lot of fun to read into the different meanings that you can pull out of it. But again, I'm just not quite convinced of the magical properties of tarot. Again, that's my personal thing. You may very well be convinced of it, and that's perfectly fine. You know, this is every form of divination is going to be slightly different for everybody. Because now let's talk about one of the weird forms of divination I was able to dig out of history. I can't remember, I'm so sorry, but trust me when I say I read this. It was either in Saxo Grammaticus' The History of the Danes, it was either or in Heimskringla or in a history book that I read. But one form of divination in the past was literally to just draw lines in the sand or in the dirt, and then based on those lines being either even or an odd number would give you a positive or a negative consult into whatever it was in life. And so this to me very much rings into like picking daisies or picking flowers, petals off a flower, and it's like, oh, if you're left with a flower, it's a good or a bad thing. I can't remember at this point. If someone's like they love you or they love me not kind of thing, that's a form of divination, that's leaked into our modern society that we just accept as children. That's not something that is magical. But again, going down to those simple things, drawing lines in the sand, picking petals off of flowers, these are all forms of divination, and they're very simple. Is there magical properties to them? Maybe not. But, I still think that the placebo effect is there because you're going to teach yourself, oh, well, I wanted to say that this person loves me, and so therefore I know I love that person, or I want that person to love me. So you're still getting a positive attribute, a positive benefit out of the divination that you're performing. Now let's get a little bit weird for a second. So one thing I want to talk about with divination is I do think, and this is my personal theory coming from a Norse pagan background, is I do believe that there is a magical component to divination. It's because it taps into fate. Because fate is such a big component of Norse paganism, of Norse mythology, with the Norns, the carving of fate, the weaving of fate, whatever you want to call it. But fate in general is a big, important factor of a lot of mythologies around the world. And so, and beating one's fate, or finding one's fate, and your fated day. So I really do think that divination, when you cast the runes and do it in a ritualistic way, I do think it can tap into what fate is, and then divine from fate, divine from those threads, divine from the Norns. And so I do think that the Norns have an important component to play with the runes, and maybe even any form of divination. And so, when I did my rune carvings, when I actually carved my own runes and activated my runes, so to speak, I did call to the Norns in that moment, and at least acknowledge their powers into divining fate. And so, I didn't want this whole video just to be me sitting here like, oh, it's all placebo effect. I do think there is a magical component to this. It's just something that I'm still exploring, and I'd love to know what your thoughts are down below on the magical components of divination. Now, the last thing I really want to dive into here a little bit is a common form of divination, or not even necessarily divination, but just like asking something of the gods when it comes to weather. And I wanted to cover it in this video a little bit because that was one of the theses behind it. Is in the past, a lot of the times people would test the gods by telling them to change the weather or to predict the weather. And one of my favorite little things was in Saxo Grammaticus' The History of the Danes, Volume 2, or like the second series. It talks about, this is a Slavic pagan tradition, but it was in northern Germany, that there was a statue of a deity, and they would pile up bread and just keep piling it. And if they could still see the statue after piling all the bread of the offerings, they were going to have a bad yield the next year. But if they couldn't see the statue anymore after piling the bread, they were going to have a good year. And then there was also a horn that hung from the statue as well that they would leave alcohol into, and if it was fully drained out of it, they were going to have a good year. But if the mead was left or the drink was left, the gods were not satisfied and they were going to have a bad year. So there's just so many different random little forms of divination, but there's just so many different factors that could go into that, and especially the weather one. Now that we understand science, we understand meteorology, the changing of weather is not something that, we can just be like, gods, make it rain right now. And then you, put everything on that. You can't be like, Thor, make it thunder right now. If you don't, you're not real. And I think this is a problem, because this is actually one of the reasons that pagans began to convert within the Christianization period, because they would ask their god, they would ask Thor, or, you know, Donar, or whoever, and they would be like, if you're real, you know, Donar, then make it rain tomorrow. And if it doesn't rain tomorrow, we're going to become Christians. It's like, come on. You know, that's just now in our understanding of meteorology and things like that, you know, that's just not how weather works. And so certain things have to evolve. And so you should definitely not put everything into divination. You can't say, like, if I don't pick this daisy specific in this right way, I'm never going to find love. You just can't think like that, and you can't think that way with the gods either. Now, having said that, again, divining from nature, I think, is the biggest thing I want you to take away from this video, because divining from nature is something that still affects me to this day, and still something we look for after a ritual. Just recently in a ritual in the Netherlands, I just got done performing a Sons of Odin ritual, and right after the ritual, we just had all these birds, like, chirping and calling, and then right at the Balder section, you know, the sun rays came in at that time of the ritual, and as the ritual started, there was a raven, like an actual raven flying around, like 2 ravens, which are very rare in the southern Netherlands. And so getting signs like that, still to this day, shows that the gods are real, shows that this faith is real. And so divining from nature, I think, is one of the most powerful aspects getting into Norse paganism, or really any form of paganism, that I think you should look into. And then secondarily, looking into things such as the runes or tarot could be great places to go to. If you're looking for more of those personal connections, just understand that divining from these things is fairly modern, less so with tarot, but as far as like a Norse pagan divination with the runes, we know they divined. We know the Germanic people divine things. We know the Scandinavians divine things, but we just don't know specifically with the runes that's how they did it. But again, you can draw lines in the sand and count if it's even or odd, and that's a form of divination according to the past. Ultimately, divination is something that is a human experience. It's a human religious experience, because almost every culture on the planet has some form of divination that they use. And it can be weird, it can be strange, it can be simple, it can be complex. But find what works for you, and find what gives you the answers that you're seeking. Because ultimately, I do think there's a placebo effect. You're going to find the answers no matter what you're doing, because it's going to reveal something about yourself and what you want of an outcome. But also, I do think there is a magical component, specifically with the runes. So ultimately, it's going to be something that's going to be different for every single person looking into it, but I do hope this video has been helpful to you, and I hope it's given you a starting ground of where to look into divination and to maybe answer some of your questions. So it's historical, it can be simple, it can be complex, but ultimately it's going to be up to you and your modern explorations of this faith today. All of these names you're seeing coming down over here on the left are the wonderful people that support me on Patreon. If you're interested in getting your name on this list, please think about going down below and joining Patreon today. Thank you all. You're absolutely wonderful. Thank you for believing in this channel and the strange and wonderful things I get to talk about here at the Wisdom of Odin. Thank you very much, and until the hall, Skål.